Oui.
À la table, je suis. Voilà. Great. Good afternoon again. We are delighted to be joined by Louise Arbour, who has been leading the Secretariat's and the Secretary General's effort on the Migration Pact, and she's here to brief you a few days or weeks ahead of Marrakech.
Thank
welcome.
you.
It's on. On touche pas.
12 days, actually, and counting with little marks on the wall. So we are gearing up to the conference in Marrakech. Maybe I could just give you a little recap of the process and where we stand, and then I'll be very happy to answer any of your questions. This process, of course, is governed by a resolution of the General Assembly about the modalities of the adoption of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, you know, the origin in the New York Declaration. So we are now in the really final phases of this process. It started with extensive consultations, about 6 months of also pretty intensive, and I might add, not secret, negotiations amongst member states, which led on the 13th of July to an agreement by all member states except the United States, who did not participate in the negotiation process, led to the agreement on the text of the Global Compact. It's a document that comprises some 23 objectives. It asserts, of course, in very explicit terms that migration is a matter that has to respect fully state sovereignty. States have the prerogative, in fact, the duty to control their borders, determine what non-nationals can enter their territories, under what terms and conditions, subject to international law and, of course, any domestic constraints. So the text was agreed upon in July to be adopted in a formal fashion in Marrakech on December 10 and 11. It's a high-level conference convened at head of state, head of government level, and it's well in place. The Moroccans, the Moroccan authorities have deployed a lot of efforts in hosting this event. And we are looking forward to what will be the next chapter, which is, in terms of process, it will come back probably shortly after Marrakech to the General Assembly for a resolution that will then endorse the adoption of this intergovernmental conference. So there are 2 additional steps in the process. And then after that, it's essentially going to require mobilization at sub-regional, regional, global level, and naturally a lot of domestic initiatives at the discretion of member states to implement what is obviously a non-legally binding document, but is the beginning, I think, of the first ever really serious effort to enhance international cooperation on the management of cross-border human mobility. This is where we are.
Thank you. Mr. Abadi?
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much for this briefing. What action do you expect to come out of the conference in Marrakech, besides going to the General Assembly?
Well, I think the first thing is, of course, this procedural step of the formal adoption of the compact. And the way the conference in Marrakech is structured is alongside the plenary, where member states will make statements. There are 2 dialogues which will focus on implementations, partnerships, innovations. So taking discrete parts of this very comprehensive document, looking at issues, ranging from reducing the cost of transfer of remittances to better skills development, all kinds of initiatives will be discussed with panels of experts, with the private sector, civil society, and, of course, member states. What comes next, as I said, is going to be essentially what member states want to make of it, individually, sub-regionally, and collectively, in taking any aspect of it forward.
Carol, then Joe.
Madame Arbour, I'm Carol Landry with Agence France Presse. How many countries have pulled out since the U.S. decision? And what do you make of countries now exiting an agreement that was negotiated and agreed, as you said, many months ago? What's going on in your view?
Well, first of all, it's a little bit difficult to tell you what countries have, quote, pulled out, because not everybody has notified either my office or the office of the President of the General Assembly or DGACM or anybody else of their intentions. So we've read many things in the press about, and then again, the use of language is also very puzzling. It goes from "we will not sign," which is probably just as well because there's nothing to sign. This is not a treaty or it's an adoption. There's no signature. Others have said we will not participate. In the press, others have said we no longer endorse or support the compact. And everything that has been said publicly, so I think you could count as well as I can and make out of it whatever it means. I'm not sure if it means that some of these member states, who of course were present and fully engaged in the negotiations, will not attend the Marrakech conference, or will attend and do what they are perfectly entitled to do, which is express, as the document is being adopted, very much, I hope, by consensus, considering the support from this very large majority of member states, may express any misgivings, concerns, and so on, which actually would be helpful because it's actually not very precise what the concerns are to the extent that we read them in public statements, such as that this document is an affront to state sovereignty. Well, it's not very helpful. Actually, it specifically says the opposite. So maybe this will be an opportunity for some if they have concerns about any parts of it. Another concern that is often read in the press is that this document precludes any distinctions between regular and irregular migrants, which, again, is exactly the opposite of what the text says. It specifically says that national authorities are at full liberty to have policies that distinguish between regular and irregular migrants. So maybe Marrakech will shed some light on any concerns, if there are any, that member states want to express.
But if I could just follow up, I mean, what do you see happening? The suggestion is that the migration compact has fallen victim to the domestic politics in many countries from the hard right. Do you think that's a fair explanation?
Well, I don't want to generalize. I think it's going to be for the countries concerned to examine where it leaves them as international players, to participate in negotiations through which they extracted concessions from others. I mean, I was there. Some countries and some regions had certain interests that were less important to others. Negotiations are trade-offs. So I think they'll have to reflect on where it leaves them when they've engaged, one has to assume in good faith, in their external policies, in their foreign policies, in a process of multilateral negotiations on a global issue that presents a lot of complexities, a lot of competing interests, and is essentially at its core a project to better cooperate, essentially so as to ensure that national policies can be more effectively put in place, where it leaves them as a credible actor in a multilateral system if, after having agreed, having extracted concessions from others and agreed on a text, some parts of their political apparatus is now questioning the wisdom of a foreign policy that was deployed in good faith through that process. It's for them and for their citizens to ask themselves where it leaves them as international players on difficult, complex global issues.
Joe?
Yes. Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. First, a procedural question. What will constitute adoption at the General Assembly? You mentioned consensus. If the small arms treaty is an example, that required virtually all member states to basically sign on and agree. Is a similar process going to be used here? That's the procedural question. Substantively, and I have looked at at least the early draft of the compact, is there any language comparable to what's in Article 2 of the 1951 Refugee Convention that specifically imposes responsibility, in that case on the refugees, in this case would be the migrants, to abide by the laws, regulations, and measures adopted by their the destination countries. And we've already seen violence by the migrant caravans entering Mexico, and then just over the weekend, the rock throwing at the U.S.-Mexico border at border control personnel. So is there anything in the Migration Compact as specific about the responsibility of the migrants as there is in the Refugee Convention about the responsibility of the refugees?
On the first question, as I said, there are two steps in the process. There's the adoption in Marrakech, and then the General Assembly. There will be a resolution endorsing that. In both processes, it's governed by General Assembly rules. So it could be done by consensus with explanation of position either before or after the consensus is gavelled, or there could be a request for a vote. I mean, technically. But the resolution that constructs the Intergovernmental Conference very clearly contemplates the expectation that it will be adopted by consensus, considering that the text itself will have been agreed upon beforehand. But all is governed by the rules of the General Assembly. As for any language imposing obligations on migrants, I'd have to pull out the text to see if I could find specific language, but it's actually, I think, blatantly obvious that every person who enters a territory is subject to the national laws of that territory. That includes tourists. It includes migrants, whether they're in a regular or irregular situation. I don't think there's any suggestion that migrants can be exempt from the compliance with the laws of the territory on which they find themselves.
Well, the drafters of the Refugee Convention thought it was necessary to spell that out very specifically, and part of the debate that's going on, at least vis-a-vis the caravans, is that there's already been violence demonstrated by a significant number of the migrants in the caravans entering Mexico, and then, as we said recently, at the U.S.-Mexican border. So the issue really is to we talk about all the rights of the migrants and respecting their dignity, but shouldn't there be some declarations specifically that the migrants too have responsibilities if their rights are to be taken into account? But I mean, it's not in the. I don't recall it being in this document.
But is there any doubt in anybody's mind that the full force of U.S. or Mexican law will be applied on those who are engaging in these kinds of activities?
Do you think they should be turned away? Do you think they should be turned away?
Joe, let's go to the back to EFE. Marco.
Thank you. Mario Villar with Agencia EFE from Spain. Two questions, if I may. One, do you have any indication of how many heads of state and government are going to be in Marrakech? And two, in your view, will the states that choose to not participate in this compact be in a worse position when it comes to dealing with migration vis-a-vis the ones that are cooperating in this initiative? Thanks.
Unfortunately, I can't give you numbers because the process, the Secretary General issued an invitation letter. Some member states have responded to the letter merely saying that they will be there. Others have said that their president or the prime minister will be there. Others have simply registered a speaker, so I don't have numbers. There's certainly several heads of states and governments that have identified their intention to participate. Others, particularly at that level, don't like to make it public too soon before a conference. But so unfortunately, I can't give you numbers, and none of it comes through my office. So it's an unfolding process. What was
if they would be worse off? If they
oh yes. Again, I think it's difficult to determine what do we mean by are they going to be worse off. Whether member states are in Marrakech or not in Marrakech, whether they express full enthusiastic support for all parts of the compact or any kind of hesitation, they will come out of that with no additional legally binding obligation. So what they will make of it nationally, sub-regionally, regionally is what they will decide to do. So implementation, I think, is going to be the next chapter. It doesn't compel any activity on anybody. It doesn't preclude any. So, but the question is, to me, there's a larger question of where, on global issues, what investments do all member states want to make in participation in a multilateral process, which, as I said, in my opinion, is really at the beginning. I mean, this is not the end of the international conversation on human mobility. The demographic projections, the effect of climate change, of new technologies, the demographic distribution of the world population, everything tells us that today is the right time to start a conversation about how to get it right and do it right for everybody's benefit, countries of origin, migrants themselves, transit countries, countries of destination, eventual return. So it will be, I think, what member states are willing to invest in moving forward this agenda.
Great.
Hi, thanks so much, James Reinl. I'm still trying to get my head around what are the real-world implications of this post-adoption. I mean, Joseph mentioned this case down on the border between the United States and Mexico in Tijuana. You know, obviously it's a chaotic mess down there. What's happening? Stones, rocks being thrown by the migrants, and tear gas being fired back by the American authorities. I mean, if this were to happen, if the same situation were to happen after the adoption of your compact, what would be different? How would the situation be handled differently? Like I say, in this scenario, what are the real-world implications of this compact?
I think the only thing I could tell you when I say it's a non-legally binding document, I think the best analogy is the SDGs. Not a treaty, it's not a legally binding document, but it has been the framework within which all countries of the world have agreed that if we're going to maximize the benefit of our investments in development, this is the framework. Not everybody likes all the parts. In fact, migration is under the SDGs. It has a development aspect. It also has a humanitarian aspect. It has security aspects. It has economic aspects. But within the SDGs, it's really interesting. Migration is under the SDG, which the goal of which is to reduce inequalities within and between countries. It's an interesting perspective. Does it bind anybody to adopt any particular law or to refrain or engage in any particular course of action? So the answer is, if what you describe happening at the southern border of the U.S. took place on December 13, the day after the adoption, rather than today, I don't think it would make any difference. Which doesn't mean this is a total waste of time. This is a global project of international cooperation that deals with every aspect of human mobility. Let me just because you raised that particular issue, first of all, this is a global issue. I think it's really important not to constantly look at it from a very kind of Western-centric perspective. The fact that 12,000 people are trying to crash the border, enter a country of 330 million people, this is not the face of international migration. This is one aspect of it. It cannot be used, it seems to me, to characterize what are les enjeux, what is at stake in this common project. The other thing is, every time we talk about migration, to use the language of the experts, there's a difference between stocks and flows. We constantly refer to flows, people on the move. But the reality, when you see the numbers from DESA, for instance, that there's 258 migrants in the world today, that refers to people who now live and work, hopefully work, for more than a year in a country other than their country of origin or citizenship. Doesn't capture the flow. It's all about stocks. And that raises all kinds of issues that the compact deals with in a very smart way, increasing skills partnerships. What are the projected labor market deficits, say, in some Western countries, and how could others position their education system to match this labor market supply and demand on the global scale? So there are lots of things like this that have nothing to do with either the tragedy, I think, of humanitarian issues that some migrants experience in transit. The reality is most migrants move through perfectly legal channels. They still face, labor discrimination, xenophobia. There are lots of issues. But the reality is this is what we need to do better with to maximize its benefit. and I think not be hypnotized by specific incidents that do not reflect the global aspect of cross-border mobility.
Evelyn and Fetty.
Good to see you again. Evelyn Leopold. Do you have any theory of why it seems to be the Eastern Europeans, are they all mini Trumps or what, that they're backing out of the conference? The Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovakia is thinking about it. Austria's announced. I'm just curious. Also, a few hundred people at the border today didn't make a caravan.
I don't have any theory. I think this is a question that is that Europeans, members of the European Union, Europeans have to ask themselves. I think it's fair to say that it appeared pretty traumatic for European countries, members of the European Union, throughout the negotiations, not to speak as a fully unified voice. As you may recall, those of you who followed the negotiations, the EU position was never put forward as an EU position, but Austria, as it turns out, took the floor throughout the negotiations in its national capacity and on behalf of 27 members of the European Union, because Hungary, which was also present throughout the negotiation and at the adoption of the text, at the agreement on the text, would not join the European consensus. I think your question is a very important one, and one that I'm sure European leaders and the European public, I know, ironic, isn't it?
Thank you. Just to follow up on you reviewed the spectrum of positions by different countries that either pulled out, not going to continue endorsing, etc. Now, what it looks like that destination countries are taking a negative position on the compact, which is not legally binding. Are we going to end up with countries exporting migration and the receiving end, it's going to be out of the compact? How this will play out?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by countries exporting migration.
That the countries where the migrants originate from. Like in Africa, like in Latin America, etc. Well, the U.S. is out, so that's Central and Latin America is whom traditionally migrants originate from coming to the United States, from North Africa and West Africa, where traditionally they migrate to European countries. Since we have now a strategic bloc in Europe, Central Europe or East Europe is just clearly, blatantly saying that we are not going to be part of this compact.
But this, again, I don't think this has anything to do with the compact. When some, in the course of the negotiations or in the press, some politicians, as it turned out, would say something like, migration is a bad thing. This is completely ridiculous. Migration is a thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's a thing. There are today 3.4% of the world's population who are migrant. In the year 2000, it was 2.7%. It's a phenomenon. It has been up to now on the increase. Will it continue to increase? When we look at the demographics and many factors, climate change, there's an expectation that we'll see maybe even more people on the move. And therefore, what is a good thing is to try to manage that the best way we can collectively. What is a bad thing is to do nothing and let it unfold in a chaotic, dangerous, unruly manners, with countries losing control of their borders, having people in their country that they don't know are there, feeding their informal economy from which they don't have a tax base. That's not good. But migration itself is not a good or a bad thing. Migrants, I think, should be encouraged, if they want to leave their country, to go to a place where they are welcome through legal channels. That, I think, is very much what this compact is about. It doesn't force any country to welcome foreigners or any particular kind of foreigners. Countries that have this is different from refugees again, but countries that have migration policies, recognizing their labor market deficits, for instance, which is essentially almost all of the Western world, and this is likely to increase, have every interest in trying to attract what? usually they try to attract high-skilled workers. The reality is they also have lots of needs at the lower skilled markets. This will continue, and migrants, I think, should be well-informed and should use safe and legal channels to go and work where, in fact, there's work for them. And even better, they should be trained in anticipation of the labor market needs of the countries that are likely to experience a deficit. The care sector, for instance, domestic care, where women, migrant workers find an outlet. Projections are that with aging populations in the West, there will be a high demand for that. It makes sense then, in the spirit of partnership, which is in the compact, for the countries that can anticipate in the next 5-10 years to have severe shortages in certain sectors of their economy, to partner with developing countries to train these people to do the kinds of jobs that will be needed, rather than a kind of free-for-all where you may train people as mechanics, but the demands will be in the agriculture sector. The Global Compact is about that. It's about skills development, skills partnerships, allowing people to go where they can make a living. Doesn't force anybody to take anyone, but it doesn't preclude these kinds of opportunities.
Yes, go ahead. And then
Lenka White from the Mainichi newspaper. Would you say that since the document is not legally binding, concrete impact, or when we see some concrete results of that, or would you say should there be some legally binding?
Well, as I said, I think the best analogy is with the SDGs. You could have, there are documents in the field of migration that are legally binding. For instance, the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. It's a legally binding document that has never been ratified by any Western country. So you could spend 10-15 years negotiating a treaty or a convention, legally binding text, and then it has very limited effect because it's very poorly ratified by countries of destination. On the other hand, you can have a framework like the SDGs where you have political buy-in. It's not perfect, but it channels the energies going in a particular direction, and therefore it maximizes the benefits of some initiatives. This is what this compact, I think, purports to do, and that's why, in my view, it has such broad-based support from all regions of the world that present themselves very differently. And I should add on this that I use these terms, countries of destination, countries of transit. In the world today, increasingly, all countries are both origin, transit, and destination, and some actually increasingly so. Countries, you could go from Mexico to Morocco to Turkey to Russia. They're at once exporters of part of their population and great importers of populations.
Errol, and then up to him.
Thank you very much. Madame Arbour, as you said, this is the thing, not bad or some other thing, but whether like it or not, the migrants are on the road and the phenomenon of migration is here to address. But how, I guess my question is, especially knowing that you have a particular knowledge of the region of former Yugoslavia, because you was a prosecutor at the time for the War Crimes Tribunal, how do you address the issue that many really use that as the part of Eastern Europe as a political platform, use the immigrants, use particularly Marrakech Agreement to raise a xenophobia issue and everything. So how you address that, and whether this Marrakech Agreement will be helpful to fight xenophobia and other bad issues?
Well, I think one of the objectives, again, in the compact is to encourage member states to take very robust initiatives. First of all, to anchor migration debate in facts, not in fiction, not in mythology, but in reality, and to combat xenophobia, racism, all forms of intolerance. The UN already has mechanisms through the Human Rights Council and so on to do that. The compact does not invent anything, but it reaffirms the importance of combating these kinds of attitudes that are directed not just at migrants, at foreigners generally, and very often at native populations in a country. I mean, people express these kinds of sentiments against their fellow citizens. But it's very acute when it's addressed to foreigners. So that project is an ongoing one, and part of that is governed by international human rights law, for instance. But this, I think, is beyond the scope of this initiative to prevent, in a world where whether or not one believes in free expression, the reality is there's a free-for-all of public debate, not all of which anchored in reality, not all of which conducted in good faith. This is, unfortunately, the environment in which member states and civil society and the private sector have to navigate this issue, which, again, if it's well managed, yields tremendous benefits. I mean, there are many countries today in that region and others where the remittances that migrants send back home amount to up to 20-25% of GDP. I mean, this is part of the reality. There are parts of the world, the Gulf countries, for instance, where up to 80% of the population is made out of foreign workers. That's a migration issue. So, as I said before, we cannot fixate on a particular configuration of this issue. The compact deals with it in a very broad, very global perspective, but it's at the mercy of very potent hostile forces that, in my opinion, actually work very much against their national self-interest.
Abdelhamid.
Thank you, Abdelhamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. I have noticed that Germany is playing a leadership role in this compact. Can you tell us more about the role of Germany and other countries who are really taking the lead on that? And the second, do you anticipate a future office here at the UN to look after this compact and see which country is implementing it and which country needs advice, which country needs to be notified about violation, some kind of violation of the terms of this compact? Thank you.
I think it's difficult to, if we come back to the negotiation process, to identify sort of particular champions of the global compact. There's no question it's a very delicate issue domestically, even in countries where the current government, for instance, very much understands its economic self-interest in some cases importing workforce. Even there, because there's so much misgivings and hostile attitudes, as I said, even when it's contrary to a self-interest. In the negotiations of the compact, there are many countries in every part of the world that were promoting the need for better international cooperation. I think being very conscious that their best way to have their national policies enforced is through the cooperation of their neighbors. So it's difficult to single out. And again, those who stand up for the virtue of the compact should not be identified as pro-migration. This is not the point, as I said. It's not because migration is good or bad. Well-managed cross-border mobility is good. Poorly managed is very bad.
Okay, and then two more questions.
Hi, Matthias Ask with TV2 Norway. You mentioned earlier that not all the countries that have disavowed this accord in the press have reached out to your office. How many have actually reached out to your office or the PGA?
I can't speak for the PGA. I'm not on top on a daily basis of what they have, but I can say, as I understand it, those to us, so to my office, Hungary has said that it would pull out. Austria would not sign. Poland not supporting the adoption. Australia not attending. Israel not attending. But there's more than that in the press. But what I could, and as I said, this language doesn't follow the technical language of the process, but it gives you a sense of the misgivings or buyer's remorse, because all those, of course, were there on the agreed text.
Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azem from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have two questions. The first one regarding where would you like to see to go forwards after the the adoption of the resolution when you come back to the UN, and I'm supposed it's going to be adopted. and which steps you would like to happen afterwards, and whether there will be any mechanism regarding monitoring the implementation. And the second question is, what do you say to the U.S. administration, a country that is only has immigrants, of course, except for Native Americans and African Americans? Which message do you think the administration is sending to the world when they are not, what they are losing when they are not part of this negotiation and part of this? They don't have voice on the table. They choose not to have. Thank you.
So, as I said, what will happen subsequent to the adoption of the text in Marrakech and the adoption of through a GA resolution is whatever member states will want to make of it, in part. In the meantime, the Secretary General had proposed in his report last January, which was then endorsed in the text of the Global Compact, to create the UN Migration Network. So the UN, especially after this is endorsed by a GA resolution, will be poised to position itself to better support member states who want to move forward on parts of the compact, whether nationally, sub-regionally, regionally, or globally. This UN Migration Network will be coordinated by IOM, and will be the secretariat for the network will be provided for by IOM, and will comprise a large number of UN agencies that have at least an interest or a mandate on migration, with an executive committee made out of, I would say, the main players, that is, the agencies that have a clear and very engaged mandate on migration. IOM, obviously, UNHCR, although on refugees, but on mixed flows, humanitarian issues, very engaged, OHCHR, ILO on all the labor-related issues, UNODC, UNDESA, UNDP. So this core group will be the executive committee of the network. So come January, whatever region, the economic commissions are also all part of the network. So they will be able to come to the UN to say, we would like to launch, say, an initiative on the reduction of the cost of transfer of remittances, or we want to launch an initiative on skills development, or on portability of benefit to enhance, to facilitate returns. A huge variety of initiatives. The UN will be positioned to support member states regionally or domestically who want to move forward. And with respect to the U.S., I mean, all I could say is, honestly, I think it's a double loss. It really is a loss for the international community on a global issue to have the multilateral system deprived of any voice, but particularly on a voice which, on an issue like this one, has so much to contribute. I mean, a long history of building an economy through inclusion of migrants and so on. And I believe it's a loss for any country, including for the United States, not to position itself to seek and obtain political engagement of cooperation of its immediate neighbors, but also of the world at large, so as to make sure that its domestic policies are well understood, well supported in that cooperative spirit. So I really believe that it's unfortunate, and it is, to some extent, a loss on both sides.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.